When I heard about podcasting as a way to talk to people, I kind of used this as my way of like hanging out with people, talking to people. And yeah, I mean, I did struggle with like, I don't want to say social anxiety. I'm not diagnosed with it, but it's like I did develop a fear of talking to people, and like I don't ever want to become a burden. So using podcasts as a way to like meet with different people and get to know their story, I felt like at the time this was the best way to like, I guess, quote unquote, hang out with friends. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Oh My Curry Goodness. My name is Hamza Islam. On each episode of the podcast, I talk to Gen Zers from different fields about their story and the experiences that have shaped them into who they are today. When I bring a guest on to this podcast, I want my guest to be as authentic and honest as possible because when we allow our guests to do that, we are able to connect with them in a very unique way. And I hope you guys as listeners take a few things away from each guest as you continue to write your own story. And also just knowing that even though they've done incredible things in their life, that they are human beings who have overcome many different obstacles, challenges, setbacks in order to become the person they are today. And I want to create a podcast where you really have that feeling of you're not alone. While many of us have different obstacles and challenges, it can seem like we're the only one going through those things. But the truth is, there are a lot of people who can relate to us in one way or another. So being able to be inspired by people's stories gives you that sense of hope that no matter what challenges or obstacles you're going through, that you are able to overcome them at some point in the future. So I hope you continue to be inspired by each guest and continue to take away lessons from what they have gone through to help them be the person they are today. And I hope you guys continue to support this podcast going forward. Now, this is the last episode of 2023, and it has been such an amazing, I've had such an amazing time interviewing a lot of or incredible people, but there's one person I haven't got to talk about as much, and that's myself. I probably should have done this back in January when I first started this podcast, so people can get to understand more about me and why I do the things that I do. And I don't know why. I wish if I went back in a time machine, I changed all that. But here we are now. I felt like this is a great way to end 2023, which is to talk about myself, a little bit about me, and why I do the things that I do. So, to help me with this episode, I am joined by my friend and audio engineer of the podcast, Ben Rumi. So, Ben, thank you so much for being able to do this. He is going to technically be the host of this podcast. He's going to be asking me some questions. So, but nevertheless, Ben, thank you so much for doing this. And if you want to talk a little bit about yourself, how we met, and what you do, whether it's on the podcast or off the podcast, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Hamza. First off, obviously, thanks for having me on. It's good to be on the show. And congratulations, making it a whole year. That's absolutely fantastic. So I'm really glad to have kind of been on this journey with you with that. So yeah, like Hamza said, I am kind of one of the behind the scenes guys for the Oh My Curry Goodness podcast. I provided the main themes that are used at the opening speech of the show. And every now and then Hamza will reach out to me and be like, hey, could you take a look at this video and make sure the audio kind of works on it and all that? And I'll be like, yeah, I'll take care of it for you. Um, so that's kind of how I contribute my little bit to it. But it's great watching the show change, develop, all for the better over the time. Um, yeah. Have I missed anything with that? Or
No, that was great. But yeah, if you also want to talk about a little bit about like what you do outside the podcast, because I know
yeah,
you have
yeah.
a life outside of podcasting.
Yeah, of course, of course. So most of what I kind of provide audio wise is more of a side hobby. My daytime job, if you will, is I'm a full-time student at the Ohio State University, and I'm studying education and foreign language with the hopes of being a high school Spanish and French teacher. So kind of a different approach to it, but um, obviously I love doing audio in my spare time. I run a side YouTube channel that I post a lot of my music on. I don't post regularly, just kind of anything that I have that I want to show up with the world. But a lot of what I've learned there and about how audio works and getting the tools and skills necessary to help provide for the podcast, that's how I kind of got it. So yeah,
That's a great way to introduce yourself. And for those who don't know, me and Ben met at, I think it was French one
it
in
was
at
introduction to French class. Yeah.
And just for clarification, I know I say this, I've said this a lot, but just in case someone's hearing this for the first time, I am also a student at at the Ohio State University. So we had French one together, and I talked about this podcast. This was back in 2022, and then obviously
Mhm.
Ben, you told me a bit about how you have experience with audio, and yeah, it's been quite a journey, these past 12 months, and a lot of people, I think what makes a great podcast is obviously not just the content, but also the music, the sound that kind of controls the podcast. And it's a lot of people really like the music, and it's you've obviously done a great job. So I appreciate you for all the things you've done, and I'm so glad that I met you in French because we've obviously developed a friendship, not just with the podcast, but also personally. So I'm grateful that you're part of the team, and obviously we're going to continue to go up, or we're going to
Mhm.
continue to go forward, even though we'll have some challenges. That's what makes the journey special in a way.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely been a bit of a roller coaster, but it's been fantastic to kind of be a part of all this. So I'm really glad you're able to have me aboard, that you're willing to have me aboard. Um, ever since that one French class which we all got together. But yeah, no, this is great, and hopefully this can help propel us into what comes next.
For sure. So, obviously, anyone who's been listening or watching this podcast, you usually see myself as the host, but I do want to make an episode about me and so people can get to know more about me. So, I'm going to be the guest of this episode, and I'm going to let Ben be the host. I know you came up with a few questions that
Oh,
you
I've
think
got
can
plenty.
you think can benefit the listeners. So, here, take it away. You are officially now the host of the podcast. Hopefully no
Woohoo.
pressure.
All right, thank you very much. Well, first off, thanks for coming on the show. It's good to have you on here, Hamza. Always nice to have a new guest on here and around. So obviously one of the kind of not more interesting, but um, the general get to know you questions that a lot of times are easy to start off with is, like kind of tell us about Hamza. Like where are you from? What did you do growing up? Kind of like what led you to where you were to kind of where you are now in life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was born in Columbus, Ohio, and I've grown up here ever since. Now, if you were to ask me when I was little what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have probably said a professional soccer player. And unfortunately, that's not something I'm doing. I retired a long time ago at the age of 13. But if there's one thing that soccer, in a way, kind of sparked my curiosity of people, it would be when I growing up, and I still am a fan today, but I'm a huge fan of the Columbus Crew, which is a soccer team in Columbus, Ohio. And when me and my dad used to have season tickets. Now we don't, just because college is like just takes up a lot of time. But growing
Mhm.
up, Columbus Crew used to have these meet the team events. So you get to like meet the players and meet the coaches. And it was weird because like some of the players on the team I was huge fans of. And so being able to meet with them and talk to them for a couple of minutes, even though it was for a couple of minutes, it was crazy at the time to think that they are human beings because they're entertainers. And while they obviously their job is to entertain people, they are also human beings at the end of the day. And so I guess from there, that's started to spark my interest in getting to know about people and like what it's like to be them. And so when I was little, it first used to be about what is it like to be an athlete, and then what it was like to be like some sort of celebrity, actor, actress, or someone who's, I guess, like famous, for lack of a better term. And yeah, I guess because of those experiences of getting to meet with soccer players, that started my I guess my journey in a way of going into storytelling and learning about people's stories. And what I think why I loved it so much is because everyone has a different perspective on life. So just because you are experiencing life in one way, it doesn't mean someone else is experiencing it the same way. So being able to be open-minded and learn about what it's like to be other people was something that I was really interested in. And I think it goes back to being able to meet soccer players from my favorite team. So that's a bit about why I do the things that I do, especially with the podcast. And
Mhm.
growing up, to be honest, one of the reasons why I was a bit hesitant to start this podcast was I think when I look back at all the people that I've interviewed, they have gone through so many different obstacles and challenges to get to where they are today. And looking back, I'm very lucky to be in a position where I didn't have to worry too much about anything. In fact, the only thing I really worried about growing up was getting the best grades possible. But then there are other people who have gone through mental health challenges or moving from one country to another and trying to
Mhm.
understand your environment. So for me, that was the only thing I was really worried. Like that was the only thing I had difficulty in, was just like, am I getting good grades? But then now listening to the stories, I think what's important is you can still experience the pain that you're experiencing, like if you have a bad grade or a bad test. But it's also important to kind of put yourself in other people's shoes and knowing that people are going through much more difficult challenges than what you're going through. My dad was an international student. He was born in Bangladesh. He studied here in the United States. And forget getting good grades. I mean, as an international student, trying to adapt in a different country with different environment, different culture, paying for food, housing, like those are different challenges. So forget
Mhm.
school. There's so many things outside. And so that's why I was a bit hesitant. And I feel like I said, I'm very lucky to be in a position where I didn't have to worry as much. But that's why I wanted to start the podcast, was I wanted to know what is it like to be other people, because I know not everyone happens to be in the same position as me. So that's a bit about me, my in my terms of my curiosity and in terms of like a little bit about my upbringing in some sense. And yeah, I know, like I said, I can't relate to these people directly, but if there's one thing I love about the podcast and why I do the things that I do, it goes back to just that curiosity of what it's like to be a particular person.
Yeah, and especially because a lot of times, like even when it seems we don't have, even if it seems like we don't have as many like problems or obstacles that we're facing, especially compared to someone else who is in a different situation as ourselves, a lot of times like they can serve as inspiration to us as we look to overcome those obstacles in our own lives. Obviously, there's maybe a difference in magnitude between those two obstacles that we might face, but that doesn't necessarily mean that our obstacles are any less difficult to overcome just because someone else's are greater.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add is, and it's like I always go back to this phrase. I know like we don't obviously have the same obstacles and challenges because everyone's like challenges are vary, but we can relate
Mm-hmm.
to one another. And one thing that comes to mind is like if we can use like the bad day or bad exam score, for example. When we have like a really bad exam score, we feel like it's the worst thing in the world. But then when we see other people who have had a similar experience where they had a really bad score, you want that sigh of relief. Like let's like if I were to let's use you for example. So like let's say if we were in the same, let's say French class, right? If I get a 50 out of 100 and you got a 50 out of 100, it should be a sense of like, oh, okay, I really I had a bad performance, but there's someone else who also had a bad performance, so it's like, oh, I'm not alone in this. And let's say you still do really good in school, or you still are able to do incredible things. You want that sense of like, oh, I had a bad score, but someone else has similar experience. But you don't want to be like complacent in the sense of like everything's going to be okay. You still have to work hard at what you do, but you can use someone's experience as inspiration and knowing that, okay, I may have had a bad score, but I'm not a bad, like it doesn't mean that I'm stupid or dumb, or I'm not going to do great things because this person failed and yet he's doing great. So it's about having that inspiration and then trying to figure out how to be successful in like in your own story, if that makes sense.
Definitely, definitely. You mentioned earlier that like kind of soccer was a huge thing that propelled you down this path that you currently are in. Did you have any like favorite players, or because you mentioned the Columbus Crew was a team you guys were really fond of, but any specific players on the roster or just the team as a whole?
I think it was more just the team as a whole. Um, I just think that it was really cool to have a soccer team in the city that you
Mhm.
grew up in. And a lot of my friends even now support some of the best teams in the world, which is totally understandable. But I'm someone that I feel like just because of the fact that there's a soccer team where I grew up in, that that's just my team. And I don't care if you're like the best player on the team or like a player who doesn't play that much. I think like it's so cool to be able to interact with someone who plays or who represents the city of Columbus. And I just want to know like what it's like to be a soccer player and what it's like to be you because even because you do have fans no matter how good of a player you are. And so I just want to be able to see you as just a human being and knowing that yeah, you're really good at what you do, but I'm sure you had a lot of challenges and obstacles you had to overcome in order to become a professional soccer player.
Awesome. You also mentioned that you go to the Ohio State University. Go Buckeyes, by the way, of course. Um, how did that kind of start? Like, what made you choose Ohio State over maybe any other competing college? And after choosing Ohio State, what did you choose to study? Or if you chose something and then Ohio State?
Yeah, so I guess what led to Ohio State, I feel like this was the only school I wanted to go to just because it was close to home. And for a lot of people, when you go to in-state or out of state, school can be really expensive. And if you are living on campus, it can be even more expensive. So I chose this the route that was best for me, which was just to stay home. So that was basically why I chose Ohio State. Now, again, if I want to go back to the idea of like the only thing I had to worry about was grades and test scores, I think that was something that gave me a lot of anxiety because as I mean, I've talked about this on the podcast and I've told you this, but I'm someone of South Asian descent. And so the community that I grew up in really prides themselves with academics or how they're doing in like with their grades. And so for me, it was all about trying to get the best grades and scores possible, not because I wanted to like be proud. I mean, I did, but it's more like, hey guys, I have good grades and test scores too. And I felt like at the time, anything other than Ohio State would have been a failure. So if I went to community college, I thought that was like a really bad thing. So it was almost like one of those things where it's I really want to go to Ohio State. I don't see myself going anywhere else. And I anything else is considered a failure. But here I am, fortunately, I had a student at Ohio State and I've been very fortunate. I'm very happy with or very fortunate that I had people along the way to help me get there, such as my parents. When it came to my major, I study computer science at Ohio State. Now, this one was more of a roller coaster ride because my dad was a computer science major and he got me involved in computer science. But at the time, I was a bit hesitant because I remember seeing his computer and I'm like, what on earth is this? And so I was like, I'm not going to do this. At the time, if you maybe if I was 16 or 17 years old, I probably wanted, if you were to ask me then, I would have said psychology just because I was again interested in people's minds and people's like what it's like to be them. One movie that kind of inspired it was the first Batman movie, Batman Begins with Scarecrow. And I don't know why, I know he's a villain, but like just the idea of getting into people's minds, even though his was more like in a bad way, I think like just being able to read people's mind and seeing like what they're thinking kind of sparked my interest. But then some of my dad's friends were like, "You're not gonna make a career out of this. You better do computer science." And I was really intimidated by them, so then I stuck to computer science. However, senior year, when I started to figure out what I wanted to do, my dad then asked me the question, do you want to study psychology or do computer science? And I was like, I'll do computer science. And even though I didn't like it at the time, what really helped me develop an interest was just spending time alone, like spending time coding and figuring out what's my favorite programming language. So it was a roller coaster ride, but it was one of those things that it was because I got to spend time with it that really made me want to major in computer science. And yes, hypothetically, I'd love to talk to robots, but I still want to be able to talk to human beings just because, we are all human beings who are doing a lot of incredible things, but it's also important to be able to talk about our challenges that we have faced growing, or the challenges that we have faced, because it's something that a lot of human beings can relate to in a broad sense.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, talking with robots would be really cool, but like you said, like talking with humans is definitely much cooler. I mean, that's kind of why I went into, education. I originally started with an interest in languages and learning languages, but that eventually shifted into the school culture and doing what I can to support the kids. So I definitely get that. Like the more you do something, the more you kind of are exposed to it, the more you kind of develop an affection for it, kind of so to speak. A sort of like enemies turned lovers type of trope, but in this case, with it being with what you study. Um, yeah, that's awesome. You kind of mentioned, I think somewhere along the lines, of course, being of South Asian descent. Have you felt like that has in any way like been an obstacle in your life, or um, in any sense, may it be either things specific to the culture that comes with it, or maybe how other people might perceive that culture, inaccurately or not?
Um, that's a really good question. I'd say the best way to answer this was, I think for a long time I would say I would do things more so out of, I don't I'm very proud of my identity, and it's something that I have had to spend time with. Like it's one of those things where I'm still trying to figure out how to be the best. Like I'm trying to learn uh more about like like what the South Asian cultures and traditions are, just because for a long time I feel like it was just more of like I'm a South Asian in name only. Like sometimes, like how like in politics people say Republican in name only, like, oh, they're
Mhm.
only Republican because that's like what they identify as. In terms of obstacles or challenges, I think I wouldn't say it was more so with other people. Like I wouldn't mind telling people where I'm from, or like some of the things that I guess South Asians like. For example, curry, obviously a great one of my favorite foods. I've talked to people about how I love playing cricket, which is like a really long version of baseball, and obviously some people don't like it 'cause it's too long. So I guess I mean I didn't know too much about South Asian cultures and traditions, just maybe like 1%. So like it wasn't something that I really had any trouble with. But when it comes to like within the South Asian community, I think one thing I did struggle with was, I wouldn't say I was living in fear, but I did have a lot of like stress and anxiety in terms of like trying to make sure that I was like the best student possible.
Mm.
Something so like I know like in our culture, like parents love to talk about their kids. So for me, there was a lot of pressure in knowing like, okay, given that my parents' friends talk about their kids, I want to be able to make sure that my parents are able to talk about me. And so I think I don't want to say I was living in fear, because that's a bit too dark, but I did every day was a little bit of like I did worry about like what can I do? I did ask myself, what can I do so that my parents are proud of me, so that they're able to share with their friends? And I think nowadays, or like even today, um I've told people about my podcast, or about this podcast, but I haven't told them that I really want to continue on this journey. Like I really want to do this. And I think that itself is a challenge, because for a lot of people, when it comes to like different cultures, there's a specific way on how they view success. So lawyer, doctor, engineer, uh, um, business or entrepreneur, or like as long as you are like these like safe routes, if you will. And when you don't see people like podcasters, it's like, well, okay, are you making money from this? Are you the number one in this podcast, or in this like in this podcast niche? Like you're not doing any of these things. And so I feel like I've kind of developed that fear back, like constantly worrying. But yeah, that's why I feel like I do put a lot of pressure just because it's like I want to be able to let my parents know that I'm trying to do as everything I can to make them proud. So I think the obstacle is more of within the South Asian community rather than outside, just because I just want to be able to make my parents proud and whatever I do.
Mhm. Kind of those like self-imposed expectations, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's probably why I put a lot of pressure on the podcast. And for those who don't, I mean, if you've ever seen like videos of the podcast, you can probably tell that I'm overthinking, but because I care so much about what I do, and even though that there are not many South Asians who do podcasts, so because there's not that many people now, it puts a lot of pressure on me and knowing that I want to be like the best interviewer possible, sharing authentic stories. So it's a challenge, but I just hope that I can get to a place, or we can get to a place. I don't want to just make it about me, but we can get to a place where people really see what this podcast has done for people and being able to share their stories and learning about what they have learned in their life that can possibly help, that might help people or might help listeners in their own life.
Awesome. So speaking then kind of the podcast, going into college and whatnot, how did the podcast kind of like become a thing? Like what gave you the idea like, oh, I should start a podcast on this?
Yeah. So this started back in 2020 when the pandemic started. And so someone told me about, I don't think he actually ended up starting it, but he wanted to start his own podcast. And when I heard that this was a way to like interact with people, I thought, well, why not do it? And so I actually had three podcasts before Oh My Curry Goodness, but they're no longer on Spotify just because I deleted them. But it was essentially the same idea in terms of what it's like to, I just want to get to know people. And so my first podcast, it was strictly high school students because we were like it was like our senior year of high school going into college. And it was okay, but it was more of like a phone call rather than a Zoom call. And
Mhm.
so you weren't able to understand like their facial expressions. So that was one podcast. The second one I had with a co-host, but then the issue was our schedules just got in the way. The third podcast, it was just not a really good podcast, but I was still stuck on the idea of learning about people's stories. So it goes back to pandemic year of like, oh, you mean there's a way to connect or like talk to people? Because I know we have like FaceTime and everything, but I guess as someone who was like sometimes shy of talking to people, I felt like why not do a podcast? Um, and I felt like podcast is a great way to connect with people just because, and I don't know if I ever told you this, but like growing up, I didn't have that many challenges, but I also didn't feel like I fit in with like my high school friends or like my South Asian friends or college friends. It almost felt like I don't know if it was because of our schedules or maybe it's just like you're not like the right fit. So when I heard about podcasting as a way to talk to people, I kind of used this as my way of like hanging out with people, talking to people. And yeah, I mean, I did struggle with like I don't want to say social anxiety. I'm not diagnosed with it, but it's like I did develop a fear of talking to people and like I don't ever want to become a burden. So using podcasts as a way to like meet with different people and get to know their story, I felt like at the time this was the best way to like I guess quote unquote hang out with friends.
Oh, that's awesome. Three different podcasts part of that. That's really awesome because I guess like that's a great way kind of learn experience on how to do something is to just kind of do it over and over. Like you mentioned with computer science earlier, it's just raw exposure. You get more affection to it. So the same thing's probably true working with podcasting. Um, out of those three, which would you say was your favorite podcast I've worked on?
Okay, so I'll tell you the name. So the first podcast was called
Mhm.
Curry Made in America. The second podcast was called Coffee and Curry because my friend loved coffee and I loved curry. And the third one was Everybody Likes Hamza. I would say of the three, and they're unfortunately no longer they no longer exist, but of the three, I'd say Coffee and Curry was the best one because me and my co-host developed a pretty good chemistry with each other in terms of when to talk, when to like how to communicate with one another. We didn't do much preparation. I do a lot of preparation for each episode of the podcast, but at the time we didn't really do that much. But we were able to communicate with one another in terms of when to talk, when not to talk, when to ask questions if we have a guest, and just try to be as authentic and honest as possible. But the only reason why we weren't able to like continue on was just because of the scheduling conflicts.
Mhm.
But I really love the chemistry that me and my friend had on the podcast. And yeah, I do miss it, but I'm glad that I was able to take a few things away from that experience and try to implement it with this podcast.
That's awesome. A lot of common theme with having curry in the title of these podcasts, it seems. Kind of with that being a thing, do you have a favorite type of curry?
So my favorite would be, so it's called chicken makni or butter chicken. And I think what really makes the dish special is not just the chicken, but also the sauce that comes with the chicken, or like the flavor. And I think that's what it's like. It's one of those things where it's like it may not be a direct effect, but it's an indirect effect. Um, and I think that's what makes it special. It's just like the type of sauce they use. Um, it makes the experience or that feeling much better. Obviously, I love all types of curry, specifically chicken, not veggie. But I think what makes a dish really special is the is what kind of sauce they use, just to make it like just to make it like that much better.
That's awesome. You'll have to like share the recipe sometime with me so I can try it out myself one of these times.
For sure. And I just hope, like, I think one of the things I do worry about, I love curry, but the problem is that like it's a 50 there's a 50-50 chance that you might have a stomach issue. So you do have to be careful in terms of where you get it or how you make it. I think because I've made it a couple of times, and I think this is where my struggle with perfection kind of comes from, is that because you have to make it perfect, because you don't want to have like an upset stomach. I think that somehow translates into podcasting, where I care so much about being having the perfect interview. Because for and I hope you don't take offense to this, but like not like no one knows who we are, right?
Mhm.
So for us it's like we're like there's this pressure of trying to be the best, like in terms of like, okay, I don't know who this guy is, but I really love the way he asks certain questions, or I really love how the podcast is set up. Yes, it's a Zoom call and it's not in person, but still, like, there's a lot of interesting things about this podcast. So I think that's where I guess overthinking perfection kind of comes from. But at the end of the day, any creator or artist will tell you that focus more on the process and trying to be better 1% rather than focusing on being perfect, just because you have a healthier mindset when you just take it one step at a time, as opposed to trying to make everything perfect, because you don't want to hurt yourself mentally more than you need to.
No, that's definitely important. Kind of like it's obviously great to improve, but you don't want to push yourself to the point where it does become oh, I can't do this type of thing, and then it has that converse effect of, uh, kind of digging into that, knowing that it needs to be good, but it doesn't seem to be good, and then it's just kind of like, it's all falling apart then. Um, so yeah.
I actually want to ask you, because I know you're technically interviewing me, but I know you're an education major, you've been able to work with kids. Is there some sort of like, do you ever struggle with that as well? Because you obviously have a responsibility to inspire the next, like, inspire a generation, help them and navigate their life. Is there some sort of pressure you kind of put on yourself when you're working with kids, or do you feel like that doesn't really exist in your perspective?
No, yeah, there's definitely like an element of that where, kind of like if I walk up in front of the class at the start of the lesson, I'm like back in my brain, I'm like, all right, I need to make this like the best lesson I can possibly present it. Like I kind of have one shot to make an impact on the lives of these kids that are here before me. Um, Especially because right now I'm in student teaching. So like I have this very brief window of time in which I could actually potentially make this impact. So it's just kind of like, you've got that one shot before the buzzer kind of goes type of deal. So there is definitely that element of like I want to try my best, and I know it won't be completely perfect, but at the same time, I really wish it were. And so there's like a small tinge of disappointment that like I know I'm not quite there yet, if that makes sense. So yeah, there's definitely an element of that. Um, Kind of going along those lines, then in terms of like struggles with the podcast and like trying to create that like that perfect interview, so to speak. Have you had any like major kind of setbacks or obstacles that you've had to face throughout the process of creating the podcast, or kind of bringing it to fruition with any of the interviews in particular? Or
Well, it's a good question because I would say I thought like the only way to be a good podcaster would be to just ask interesting questions
Mhm.
because a lot of the people that I've interviewed have been on multiple podcasts. And so one rule that I saw on a YouTube video, which was come up with questions that people have never been asked before. And so I
Mhm.
used to have like that was the most important thing I learned about interviewing. But what I also didn't realize is that there's so many more things you need to focus on, such as the content, what you hope people gain from each episode. I feel like even today, like the introduction, that's still a work in progress, but I hope that, and I hope to continue on perfecting it or trying to make it as beneficial as possible. I didn't know the importance of having a great microphone, good lighting, good camera, because I just didn't know. And at the time, I didn't realize how much I needed it until I would play back interviews before they're published because I'm like, oh, the lighting was really bad, or my camera looks a little bit fuzzy, or my voice doesn't sound crisp or clean. And so I would say those were some of the things I had to learn along the way. But I'm glad in a way that even though I would obviously change those interviews to make sure I have a better presentable background and podcast quality, at the same time, I'm glad I went through these things because, again, it goes back to when you are working on something, there's going to be setbacks, regardless of how big or small. But it's great to document them so that people understand that it's not always perfect, that there were challenges. So I'd say that was one challenge. And then I think another thing is timing, because we're obviously students. And so we've got classes, and some classes require more work than others. So trying to find the right time to interview people, as well as trying to find the right time to do research on my guests or on the people that I'll be speaking with, that itself has a lot of challenges just because we have to think about like how much time do you want to allocate? Because yes, podcast is something that we do, but there are a lot of other things that we do that also require time, and we can't just like abandon those for this. So I think those were a couple of things I had a couple of challenges I had with the podcast. And then, oh, one other thing, it would probably just be the type of conversations we have. One of the things I really want to do now is have a conversation instead of a question and answer type of podcast. Just because when you're able to share people's vulnerabilities and stories, you want to continue to kind of build off of that.
Mhm.
Because there might be things that people say that might require some more analyzing, if that, for lack of a better term. So I don't want to be in a situation where it's like you ask me a question and then I answer and then you move on to the next question. You want to be able to have like a genuine conversation. So I
Kind of
felt
that
like,
back forth.
yeah, like that's what I didn't do, and I wish I did, just because it felt like I was disrespecting the guest because there's so many things that they said. But now I am, and I would definitely want to bring more returning guests. So I'm like, hey, let's have these types of conversations just because it felt like I didn't do enough to really get like the most authentic and vulnerable side of the person.
Mhm. No, that's kind of a really good thing to kind of point up. And especially like whenever you look at other podcasts, like obviously you don't want to be just like every other podcast. Like you want to make this one, unique on its own. But like there is an element of natural flow to it. If it kind of makes sense. Which I think, like to an extent you've been doing great, but there is obviously always room for growth for anything. But that might be uh something that maybe we could be seeing more of in future seasons of the Oh My Curry Goodness podcast.
For sure.
Um, kind of then continuing on that, you mentioned the word authenticity and kind of like trying to make a more natural presentation before the camera. Do you ever feel that like maybe you act slightly different, or like maybe you kind of like have to put on a sort of mask or facade while in front of the camera, or do you like feel completely free to just like be yourself, put it out there, and show who you truly are?
Ooh, I'd say this is more of like a 50-50 kind of thing. So when I talk about overthinking or if I stutter or if I make like a really bad joke on the podcast, not like an offensive joke, but like those jokes where you think it's
Just one
funny.
really corny
Yeah,
pun, yeah.
it's like you think it's funny, but people aren't laughing. Like the type of person I am on the podcast, I'm the same type of person in real life or like on campus. Like I do overthink. I do struggle with like what people are thinking of me. Even though I feel like I'm doing a better job of that, but it's still a challenge. I still struggle with like using filler words like and stuttering. So the type like I'm still the same person, but I will say though and I think this is just I don't think it's just a me thing. I think it's just for anybody when you are bringing in when you do have a podcast and you're bringing in a different guest when you're bringing different people on, you do kind of have to show some sort of professionalism just because they're meeting you for the first time, and so you can definitely show like bits and pieces of like yourself as a human being, but there's also a sense of like, well, these people are taking time out of their day to talk with me, so like I kind of have to respect them. And then at the same time, because of how much research and preparation I do for each guest, there is a sense of like, look, I know I want to talk about authenticity, but I also want to make sure that I don't want to sound like a narcissist. I hope I don't give off this vibe, but it's like I want to make sure that you respect me or you appreciate me as an interviewer because yes, you're able to share your story, but you want to be able to go like you want to be able to remember you remember a person for the type of interviewer they were. I think
Mhm.
so having like I'm still the same person. I still like to overthink and ramble, but there is a sense of professionalism because people are from all over the world are coming to join this podcast, meeting you for the first time, and so you want to make sure that you leave some sort of like good impression, so that they really like the experience.
That's awesome. Kind of seeing it in the sense of like, yeah, like you mentioned, there's that level of professionalism, and there's also a level of like being yourself with it, and being able to be kind of free with that. Um, how do you find the balance kind of between the two? Because you mentioned it's kind of like it's a 50-50 kind of ride, but like where how do you kind of actually like find that in there?
That's a $1 million question I'm asking whenever a guest brings on. I think it goes back to research on the guest. So trying to figure out, and sometimes what I'll do, there are people I'll meet before the podcast. Sometimes I'm meeting people on the day of. But one thing I would say is research the people that you'll be speaking with. And it's similar to like how when you're looking for a job, you want to do as much research on the company as possible so you know what to expect. And so I feel like whenever I interview a guest, sometimes like how I try to figure like professionalism and like can I be like my normal self is just dependent on the personality of the guest. So whether it's like I'll listen to podcast episodes uh that have featured the people that I'm interviewing, and then I'll see like how they communicate. Are they the type of person that likes to joke around in some sense, like they like to have fun? Are they more of a serious type of person? So I guess it just comes down to research in terms of like how they have presented themselves in the past, and then hopefully from there I'm able to get a good idea in terms of how I can portray myself in terms of like, okay, can I be a little bit can I should I be more serious, can I be more like fun in a way, or what
To try to like mirror that
yeah,
approach towards it.
kind of
Yeah,
mirror what they say.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, kind of leaning further into that then, um, when you go to research your potential guests for the shows, how do you find people that you would be willing to invite onto the show, or you're like, I guess like how do you get in touch with the guests and then like actually go through the process from that initial start to first hearing of them and then kind of actually having them on the show?
Yeah, so when I first started the podcast, I would just use Google. And so it goes back to like I was interested in learning about people's stories, but I think what was a what I didn't like about the podcast was the content. At like when like past podcasts was I don't think the content was good. And what I mean by that is when I would interview mostly friends and neighbors that either myself or my friends knew, and to be honest, people don't really care about your day in calculus. Let's just put it out there. So
Mhm.
I wanted to have that same mind, like idea of being able to learn about people's stories, but then let's reach out to people who can actually add value to it. So instead of learning about a person's day in calculus, let's talk about challenges, obstacles people face. Let's talk about what it means to represent a certain background or ethnicity, just because it's like it's a human thing. And so I went to Google and I looked up Gen Zers making a difference in the world, and I came across a good number of them. Now, unfortunately, not all of them, not everyone responded, but a good number of people did. So Google plays a part, and then also social media. Sometimes you reach out to one person, and then you'll see that there's another person that you think might add value. And so then you reach out to them. So it's a bit of social media and Google. And what I want to try to do more of going into 2024 is try to get local guests in the area as well, because while it's great to go global and national and be able to talk to people from different perspectives, I also want to be able to speak to people who have grown up in the same area as us. So that's been a difficult challenge trying to find local guests in the area. But how I look for people is I really want to know three things. Well, there's one, but there's like the third one is like obviously the million-dollar question, but the first one is who they are. Second question is what they do, and then third is what their story is. And I'm curious to know more about that than the other two, just because if I find that their story is of something of value or something you can learn, you can definitely learn from, like the challenges that they have faced to do become who they are. I really want to be able to get to know them. For example, I interviewed someone, he graduated from Ohio State this past either this year or maybe last year, maybe this year. But one of the stories that I came across was his journey of dealing with imposter syndrome and dealing with poverty, homelessness. And he's a guest from Ohio State. So I was like, wow, like you went through all these challenges and yet here you are graduating from Ohio State, pursuing something that you're really passionate about. I would love to bring you in on the podcast, but sometimes there are people that, especially on social media, where like they'll say they're an entrepreneur, they're an athlete, or they're a musician, but you don't really know their story, and so that can be a difficult challenge. Like maybe they may not add value or not, or maybe they'll add value or not, but it goes back to I guess those three questions, like who they are, what they do, and what their story is. And if I think that this is something that can really help our listeners, then let's try to bring them on. Fingers crossed that they answer, because not all the time people answer, but every once in a while you get people that will show interest, and then we start the journey of research, and then getting them on the podcast. Hope that answers your question. And that was a really long
Yeah,
answer.
yeah. No, that was great. Kind of a glimpse on like how that process works, how especially for people who might have a story that they want to share on like how they might be able to get on your radar. Um, you've mentioned that like, and obviously listeners of the podcast and show will have noticed by now, but like all the guests are fellow Gen Zers such as yourself. Is there a reason you chose specifically Generation Z to explore, or did that just happen to be a chance of circumstance?
Yeah, so I break it down into two things. The first thing would be growing up, I had friends in high school, but I didn't have any close, like I wasn't really close with them. And so I only saw friends as classmates in high school. And unfortunately, now that we're in college, we're all doing different things. And then with college, I usually hang out by myself. Like I usually eat at restaurants by myself. I usually study by myself. And if I try to reach out to different friends, they're usually busy, or sometimes they become like, I guess they become jerks. Like, why are you asking me to hang out? Like, can't you see I'm busy? And I'm like, I didn't know that. So I guess the podcast in a way is something that I wish my 16, 17-year old wishes he had, which is like friends to hang out with. Even though it's virtual, it's still better than nothing. But I also think more importantly, why I focus on Gen Z is we're growing up in a time where we have social media, we have the internet, and with technology is growing um, each year. And with social media, we've seen a lot of like six, like it almost feels like we have to play certain characters in or we have to like play a character in order to be accepted by people. And unfortunately that's something sometimes I still deal with. Like even though I can still be myself, there are times where I'm like, oh, I might need to play this kind of character because if they see me authentically, they might judge me. And so I know with Gen Zers, we sometimes we have to like we have to play a certain character in order to be accepted by people. And so I'm more focused on no, I don't really care about like the character that you play. I want to be able to like let you be you. And even
Mhm.
if your story is in like even if you have challenges, obstacles, or like you don't have to be a perfect guest. I just want to bring you on because I think even though sure you might have challenges, I think you are someone that I think people can really learn from, and I want to be able to get the human version of the person. I think what separates my podcast from a lot of podcasters out there is they focus a lot on the work or like the things that a person does, and that's totally great. I think that's a great thing to like know about what people are doing and why they're doing the things that they do. But I want to be able to focus on the humans or like the human element because whether we're activists, entrepreneurs, or whatever, or athletes, whatever, or whatever we do, we're all humans who have gone through certain things, and there are not that many podcasts that focus on humans. And so I want to be able to do that. And I know a lot of podcasts do that too. Like they focus on like, let's talk about your story, whatever you learn. But I want to do that with Gen Z just because we're growing up at a time where we it feels like we have to play certain characters. And I want to make it a challenge. I want to challenge myself to allow my guests to be vulnerable and authentic because as Gen Zers, it's like when you're able, if like, if you're telling someone to be vulnerable, authentic, you might be worried about being judged for like your worst mistakes. But I'm here going, but I want to create a podcast where I'm like, I don't really care about what you've gone through, or I take that back. I don't really like. I don't want you. I'm not expecting you to be a certain character. I just want you to be a human being, and I don't care like what you're worried about, or I don't know. I hope you. It's like I don't care about like I'm not gonna judge you. That's what I'm trying to say. Like I'm not gonna judge you. I just want to know your story and what you've learned as you continue to like write, as you continue to write your own story.
No, I think that's definitely important. Like there's definitely kind of an air of like focusing on a what you do rather than a who you are type of thing when it comes to this kind of day and age, so to speak. And I remember I'm thinking back to the episode with the Popeyes meme kid,
Oh, Dennis
kind of
Popper.
like how, yeah, how like he was sharing his experience and how it kind of grew up, and it's just like, man, I remember seeing that meme from how many eons ago, and like I had no idea this is what he was going on kind of behind the scenes, and like how this is it changed him into the person he kind of is now. So like there's definitely an element of like the human behind the screen, so to speak, and there and kind of in that similar sense, like a human behind um, like the thing they're known for, so to speak.
Yeah, and to add on to that, like I love learning about people's stories, and I want to focus on Gen Zers just because there's that hesitancy of like, wait, are you sure you want me to be vulnerable? Because like, what if you judge me? And I'm like, no, I'm not gonna judge you. I just want to, I want to learn. I'm not the type of person where I'm like, I want to correct you. I just want to like give you the mic and be able to share your story, and I want to be able to challenge my guests in terms of like I want them to think about each conversation because I want them to really reflect on what that journey was like for them. But at some point, if we continue on with this podcast, which I hope we do, I would love to bring in people from different generations that really align with our mission, which is to share people's stories so that people can take lessons from each guest. But I only want to focus on Gen Z for the time being, just because it's a great way to connect with friends, hypothetically, and also just because um, I want to challenge myself and try to get Gen Zers to be able to celebrate authenticity and vulnerability.
Awesome. And then kind of to round it out, bring everything kind of the complete culmination of everything we've talked about so far. What's kind of the long-term goal, like the like the 5 years from now type thing that you see or might see with the podcast for here at Oh My Curry Goodness, like the ultimate grandioso, so to speak.
Ah, that's a good question. I also hate this question, but but it's a good question too. I think I want to continue to do what we've been doing these past 12 months in terms of continue to bring people who want to continue who want to share stories. Um, what I want to do more of is I've never thought about this question. Um, I want to bring in I would love to have an in-person interview or like in-person interviews. That'd be really cool. But I want to continue to, I don't know. I don't really see myself changing too much about the podcast in terms of what to expect in 5 years. I feel like what you saw these past 12 months is like what you will expect to see going forward. Um, but I think what I hope to do in 5 years is kind of transition into how I can create value. So I guess I think the podcast is one thing, but I want to continue to hopefully market myself so people understand like what I can bring to table. So I hope that in 5 years I can become some sort of um, I don't know, crap. This is a really interesting question. Um, Yeah, I guess okay, let me just to put it in simple terms, I'd say there's not much I want to really change. And where I hope 5 years is we just continue to interview people, um, and then probably bring in people from different generations, just because I think while it's great to learn from Gen Zers, learning from other generations can also be helpful as well, just because they know more things.
Got a different perspective on maybe similar issues or like similar approaches.
Yeah, and I think where I was trying to go with this, because I was like, I was thinking about seeing myself as like a life coach, but no, I'm not gonna do that. But definitely focus like, and I don't know, maybe it's something I'll visit later on, but a lot of podcasts that I've listened to, they'll bring in guests to share their experiences, but then they'll also bring in guests who are an expert in a certain field. So like whether that be mental health, finance, food, faith. I think in 5 years, maybe you could see something like that just because I want my podcast to be, I think, like, I want my podcast to focus more so on the storytelling aspect as opposed to the self help, just because they're two different. I mean, I know they kind of have the same thing, but like storytelling, it's like you're just sharing people's stories. Whereas if you're asking someone who's an expert in the field, the questions are different because you're not going to be technically asking them about their journey. You're more so going to
It's
be
more
asking them about
focused on like the information they have.
yeah. So I think to round out that question, because that's a really difficult question. I do appreciate you asking me this because it is something that I do need to start thinking about. I think in terms of like the format, same thing, but in terms of the guests and the type of people I want to bring, I think that's something I want to focus or revisit. But yeah, that's something I'll be thinking of. But at the moment, um, I'm happy with where things are. But don't be shocked or surprised if we start seeing some changes here and there.
Awesome. So that should be something really exciting to kind of look forward to as we go throughout the podcasting journey. Is there anything specific for season two up and coming that you might have planned and want to make a great reveal for, or just
Well,
anything in general regarding
well,
season two coming up?
I mean, there are a lot of guests interested for season two. I can tell you that. But if there's one thing that I really want to do on this podcast, and I don't know if I don't know about your thoughts on this, but I'm just gonna say basically because maybe because I'm really hard on myself, but like I don't think I was that good of an interviewer. And in the sense that I feel like one of the things I want to do is as someone who really wants to let my guest be as authentic and honest and vulnerable as possible, I want to be able to be confident and brave in asking those challenging questions. Because my philosophy with podcasting is I don't want my guest to answer the question. I want them to really think about them. And sometimes when you're navigating a challenging topic like vulnerability and authenticity, it's very easy to feel like you're hesitant. And sometimes I've noticed because I like to watch the tape, I know in sports terms, like see like what I did right, what I did wrong. And I'm like, there are many moments where it felt like I was really hesitant to ask a certain question. But then even though I ask it, it didn't really come out right. Like it sounds like you're really scared to ask the question, but you ask it anyway. I want to be more brave and confident in being able to ask those like interesting, thought-provoking questions. So that's something I want to work on in season two. So like a personal thing, and then just continue to find ways to improve the podcast itself. And I know that's a broad term, but something like figuring out uh, how to come up with a really great introduction, because I do sometimes worry about if how I'm starting the podcast makes sense or is good enough. So I want to work on trying to work on the introduction. I want to work on developing a great relationship with the guest. Again, going back to having a conversation as opposed to a question and answer. Um, Being brave, being confident in the questions. And then fourth, I don't know if this is like a problem. I guess it just depends on person to person, but maybe try and work on timing. A lot of my interviews are usually 1 hour long, but because I again it goes back to having a conversation instead of a question and answer. Like I really want to know what you have to say, and I know there are a lot of podcasts that do the same thing where they have a long episode, but because the conversations are really insightful. But there's also times where maybe people want to see a shorter episode. So maybe like 45, 50 minutes as opposed to an hour. I don't know. Maybe that's just like negative, excuse me, negative self-talk, but I really do enjoy it. But I know there are a couple of people who are like, might want to make those episodes shorter. So I do want to work on like being more efficient. But again, I guess that can also be hard to balance because again, it does depend on a person's story and where the conversation is going. So I know that's a long response, but there's a lot of things I'm thinking of internally where I want to improve, but that's just kind of where I'm at right now.
No, that's awesome. Trying to think, you were talking about shorter episodes, and one thing that maybe came to mind was like maybe like a highlights clip would be really good of like taking some of the more, I don't want to use the word like interesting portions, but maybe certain portions of some of the longer episodes you have to kind of create that like shorter 15-20 minute kind of clip. I know a lot of times um, some of the podcasters that I follow outside of the Oh My Curry Goodness podcast, they like to utilize YouTube Shorts.
Mhm.
It's kind of like basically like make mini commercials almost for their podcast of some of specific elements that they've had recently on the show. So potentially that might be a way of approaching to it, but at the same time too, it could be really cool to see complete and full shows that are just of a shorter length. Um, but I think overall the podcast has, at least in my subjective opinion, seemed phenomenal so far. I know I'm very excited to see kind of what you have next coming around for season two, and even then some after. And I'm sure a lot of the listeners are kind of excited that we've got 1 year kind of in the book, so to speak, and then we'll come back next year with another round of it. You've mentioned there's a whole list of potential people to be interviewed with, so which is awesome, very exciting. Is there anything kind of one last like hoorah for the end of the year that you want to give to our listeners
Well,
before?
yeah, I'd say there's a couple of things. I think why I struggle with the where do you see your podcast in 5 years is that sometimes like if you were to ask me like what's I guess like the feel or the mood of the podcast, because at the end of the day, it's like I would love to have an in-person interview where you're just like having fun, or like we're talking about, we're like we're getting to know you and we're having a bowl of curry. So it's supposed to be like like stress-free, enjoyable, fun in a sense. But I also feel like I do want to add a sense of like oh, I really want to, like, I hope guests in a way remember like who I was. Like, yeah, we had fun on the podcast, but wow, this guy was really good. He did his research. He knew what he was talking about. He allowed me to open up in a way that I never have previously, or maybe I haven't done enough of. So I like to have fun, but I also like to stress at the same time because I do want to make sure those conversations are good. And so, like, I don't see myself changing too much aside from that hypothetical in-person goal, as well as maybe just visiting other generations, or maybe taking it to a different route a little bit, not too much. But the second thing I want to say is I do want to try to promote myself. So like maybe go on other people's podcasts. I know I've done a couple of those already, but I want to do more of that just because I want to share my story and share my podcast and my I guess philosophy. I know I said that a couple of times because I don't want to just ask questions. I really want to be like, I want to show people that I've done my research, and I want my guests to like really think about those questions because when you're able to reflect and think for a really long time, um, you're able to kind of you're able to like let either like myself, like as a host, or listeners kind of really take you back to what it is like to be in your shoes. So those are a couple of things, and I'll say one message I have for future guests of the podcast is that uh, I treat every interview like it's a game 7, game on the line, go big, go home. And I want to encourage, like, just know that I have done my research on you. I know that's a creepy way of saying it, but I do want to get the best out of you, and I want my guests to be able to think. And a great interview is when I'm able to really let them open up in a way they never have. And if I can do that, and if I can let them be vulnerable and authentic, and let them be able to share their story without judgment, then forget how many views an episode is getting. Just what that itself, just letting them share their story without judgment or without any sort of like fear or hesitancy, is success for me. So I think those are some things I want to add. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, or if that was a good enough answer. Sometimes I do question whether my answers are good.
No, no, I think that was great. Like it definitely wrapped it around, and it showed what you're looking forward to for the future. It showed um what we should, kind of expect going forward, which is awesome. And like I'm excited that you're excited walking forward with this, if that makes any sense. Like I'm excited on my own, of course, but like I'm excited with you also being excited to see kind of how it all kind of goes. Um, that is about all I got. Thank you for coming on to the Oh My Curry Goodness podcast. You have been a phenomenal guest. I've been very grateful and very lucky to have been your host this episode. Hopefully, we can see you again on a future episode coming back around. Um, but with that, is there anything else you have for our listeners or moving forward?
Yeah, I guess I'll take over as the host now. But yeah, no, thank you so much for being able to be the host. I actually tried to do an interview. I tried to do an episode like this, actually the day before, as of this recording, and I was trying to do it by myself, but it felt really awkward because like when you're able to trying to get yourself to be vulnerable is really difficult. Like imagine like you're not in this camp. Like imagine if you're not in the Zoom call, and I'm like, okay, so here's my story. And then as I continue to share my story, I'm like, ooh, I don't know if that made sense, or I kind of like question myself. So having
Good
some
to
sort
have
of
that
like,
feedback.
yeah, so like having some sort of like guide or like a map of some sort, like yourself, to be able to like ask me really insightful questions, and I'm able to pitch my answers or like response in a way that hopefully makes sense, was really beneficial. So I hope that everything that I said, even through like the answers I was confident in or not confident in, made sense to you, hopefully, Ben, and to my listeners. But you did a great job as a host. I think you I guess that's what it maybe going back to being feeling like a narcissist. um I think what's really helpful is learning from people who have a unique way of interviewing people. You didn't just ask those basic questions, you asked questions that gave me time to think. And I think those are the types of interviews I love listening to, because that's how you get the best out of a guest, instead of like if you know the answer just because. I mean, it's great that they know the answer, but it's like maybe it wasn't that good of a question. But when you are able to get them to think, then it's like it's not. I don't want to say like it's a bragging moment, but it's like, yep,
Aha, got him.
it's not a bragging thing, but it's more like, oh yeah, this is actually a question I need to think about, and this is how you really done your research. And I think these are some things that really make a good interviewer. So I think that's really all I'll add. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, but yeah, just thank you so
Nothing.
much for being able to do this. And yeah, you did great.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is a great opportunity. I'm glad I'm able to help out with the podcast in the many ways that I'm able to offer my meek assistance. Um, but yeah, no, thank you definitely for having me on as an interviewer. It's been great to continue. Like, obviously I've gotten to know you outside of the podcast, but to kind of like re-meet you for the first time, almost in a sense. It has been a phenomenal experience, and hopefully going forth to hopefully continue with working with the podcast, I can continue to offer my skills and services to the effort, and see you success, or see you gain success. Because I mean, I know you're going to go places, and I do honestly mean that. Like, I do think, Hamza, that you're gonna make it big in one way or another. Like, you're gonna find that success. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, well, okay, let me say this. I don't think it's going to be a me thing. It's going to be a we thing. We're all
Yeah.
going to go do great things, and I know you're going to do that too. I know I'm the host of the podcast, but the podcast isn't where it is today without people like you and the help that you are and the things that you have done to help make the podcast the best that it can be. So I do appreciate that. And hopefully I continue to be on more podcasts so I can share more parts of the story, because there's only so much I can share, just because no one wants to listen to a 2 hour podcast, although there are podcasts that do that. But to all my listeners, thank you guys so much for listening to thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of the Oh My Goodness podcast. Thank you guys for following this podcast the past 12 months. We are going to take a short break, but we will continue in 2024. But if you haven't done this yet, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at the OMCG Podcast for more information on guests, preview clips, and more. And just keep supporting the podcast. And I can't wait to see you guys next year. And who knows, you might be a guest on this podcast.